I still remember the first morning I woke up in Riverside Crest, the kind of suburban community that looked like it had been designed straight out of a glossy real estate magazine. Manicured lawns, wraparound porches, identical mailboxes with polished brass numbers. Everything had that curated neatness you only see in HOA-controlled neighborhoods. But it wasn't the houses that captured my attention that first morning. It was the river. From my back porch, the Riverside Creek cut through a stretch of land as old as the bones of the state itself. People called it a creek, but in the rainy months, it swelled into a muscular, unpredictable river that carried entire tree trunks downstream like they were nothing. The water had that deep, restless rumble, a sound you never forget once you've spent years listening to it the way I had during my military engineering days. Most people heard flowing water. I heard a warning. I had moved into Riverside Crest for peace. That was what I kept telling myself. After 30 years of service in the Army Corps of Engineers, I wanted something quiet, something stable, something that didn't require me to stare at maps, models, soil charts, or rainfall frequency tables. But life has a way of dragging you back into the things you're good at, even when you're trying to walk away. On my second day in the neighborhood, I found myself down by the bank, crouched near the waterline, examining the soil like it was second nature. Old habits die hard. The ground was softer than it should have been for early summer. The sediment line told a story, one of gradual but consistent erosion. The kind that doesn't cause panic in the moment, but sneaks up on communities after years of negligence. I ran my hand across the exposed roots of a sycamore tree that leaned a little too far toward the water. Nature was already writing its warnings into the terrain. Behind me, someone cleared their throat. "You must be the new homeowner," a woman said, her voice clipped and efficient like a pair of scissors cutting through cloth. I stood and turned to find a woman in her early 50s, dressed like she was going to a real estate showing, pastel blazer, perfectly ironed slacks, a name tag pinned to her lapel, even though this was her personal property. Karen Davenport, HOA Board President. The name tag confirmed what her tone already told me. "Just taking a look around," I said. "You're standing on association-regulated land," she replied, folding her arms. "We prefer homeowners stay on designated walking paths." I looked at the grass under my boots, then at the wide open space with absolutely no signage. Didn't see any markers. "They're not posted yet," she said, "but we expect compliance regardless." That was the moment I realized peace might not come as easily as I had hoped. She inspected me the way people inspect a used car, not out of curiosity but suspicion. What's your name again?" "Michael Turner." She nodded slowly. "Right, the retired engineer." I hadn't told anyone that. My realtor must have. And she'd filed that information away like ammunition. Karen glanced at the river, then at me, then at the river again. "I hope you're not planning to start any projects near the water. The HOA maintains oversight of all Riverbank activity." "Just looking," I said. "Well, look from the trail next time," she answered, turning sharply and walking away. I watched her go, an uneasy knot forming down to my stomach. Most people don't bother asserting authority unless they feel threatened. I didn't know what I was threatening, not yet, but the way she looked at me made something clear. Whatever future conflict was brewing in Riverside Crest, I had just stepped into the opening chapter. For the first week, I tried not to think about the erosion. I focused on unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, and sitting on my porch at sunset with a glass of iced tea. The river whispered in the background every evening, a soft, steady reminder of the one thing I didn't want to think about. I told myself it was none of my business. I was retired. These people had their systems, their committees, their little suburban kingdom. They didn't need me. But ignoring a river is like ignoring chest pain. Eventually, it demands attention. A few days later, I noticed a group of workers surveying the land near the bend where the current hit hardest. They had vests on clipboards and an air of corporate confidence. That kind of activity always meant something expensive. I walked over, staying on the designated path, just in case Karen was perched in a tree waiting to sight me. "What are you folks measuring?" I asked one of the workers. He checked his sheet. "Preliminary assessment for the Riverside Crest Tower project." "Tower," I repeated, as in high-rise. "Yep, HOA-sponsored development. Luxury condo tower, 30 stories." I looked at the river, then at the soil, then back at the worker. "Here," he shrugged, "we just measure." But I knew enough. A tower needs deep foundations. Deep foundations need stable soil. Riverbanks, especially shifting ones like this, don't offer stability. It was like building a skyscraper on a sandcastle. That night, I barely slept. It wasn't fear. It was frustration. I wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble was planning a 30-story tower. A few mornings later, I attended my first HOA meeting. I didn't plan to speak. I just wanted to listen. The community center was packed, residents sipping coffee, chatting about neighborhood gossip, completely oblivious to the looming disaster being drafted in bright presentation slides. Karen stood at the front, glowing with pride as she announced the future of Riverside Crest. A landmark tower, a symbol of our community's progress. A luxury destination that will increase all of our property values. People applauded. I sat there stunned. When she opened the floor for comments, I raised my hand. Her smile froze. Yes, Mr. Turner. Has anyone considered the riverbank erosion? I asked calmly. The soil composition in that area isn't stable enough to support that kind of weight. It's risky. Karen blinked twice, then laughed, actually laughed in front of everyone. Oh, please, she said. Let's not be dramatic. The riverbank is perfectly fine. We've lived here for 20 years, and nothing has ever slipped into the water. Mr. Turner, with all due respect, perhaps you're still in engineer mode. A few people chuckled, but I saw the flash in her eyes, not amusement, insecurity. I sat back, choosing not to escalate. Not yet. Karen ended the meeting with a smile that felt like a warning. That concludes tonight's session. And Mr. Turner, feel free to speak with me afterward if you'd like help adjusting to our community guidelines. It was the kind of smile people give before they start sharpening their knives. As the crowd dispersed, the river outside continued to whisper. But tonight, it felt louder. More urgent, like it knew the storm was coming not from the sky, but from the HOA. Because this was the moment I understood something crucial. I hadn't moved into Riverside Crest for peace. I had moved into the calm before a disaster. I should have known that speaking up at that HOA meeting wouldn't be the end of it. People like Karen never let something go, not when they feel their authority is being challenged. And I hadn't just challenged her. I had questioned the crown jewel of her self-image, her leadership. Her vision, her dream of turning Riverside Crest into some kind of suburban empire, with her name quietly stamped on every inch of it. The morning after the meeting, I woke to a neatly folded sheet of paper tucked into the seam of my front door. No envelope, no knock, no introduction. Just a cold, crisp warning marked with the HOA letterhead. Notice of concern, disruptive commentary within community meeting. I read the phrase twice. Disruptive commentary. I'd spent decades briefing colonels, senators, and federal inspectors on soil integrity and flood risk matrices. Never once had anyone accused me of being disruptive. At the bottom was a signature sharp angular full of self-importance. Karen Davenport, HOA President. Of course. I stepped onto my porch, letting the paper hang loosely in my hand as I watched the early morning mist drift off the river. Birds were waking up. The air smelled like wet earth. The world felt calm, but something inside me was tightening like a fist. I walked down to the mailbox, hoping maybe the universe would balance the scales with something pleasant, a welcome letter, a neighbor's introduction, anything. Instead, my mailbox was stuffed with freshly printed HOA newsletters. The headline was impossible to miss. Riverside Crest Tower, a new era of prosperity. And beneath it, in smaller letters, do not allow misinformation to affect community progress. I didn't need 3 guesses to know who had written that line. As I walked back toward my house, I spotted my next-door neighbor, an older man named Harvey, watering his garden. He had a stooped posture that made everything about him seem apologetic, even the way he waved. "Morning, Michael," he said softly. "Saw you speaking at the meeting last night." I didn't respond immediately. I just waited. Harvey sighed. "You're not wrong about the riverbank. We all know it's shifting. Everyone's known for years." "Then why didn't anyone say anything last night?" I asked. He lowered his voice, even though no one else was around. "Because Karen doesn't take kindly to being questioned. She's been running the HOA for a decade. People learn to keep their heads down. Fear." That was the undertone I heard, fear wrapped in neighborly politeness. He leaned closer. "Look, if you're planning to make that riverbank issue a fight, be careful. She goes after people." "I'm not planning a fight," I replied. "I just don't want a tower sliding into the water." Harvey glanced nervously toward Karen's house, a perfectly symmetrical colonial with 2 flags, 3 security cameras, and a front yard trimmed within an inch of its life. "Well, don't say I didn't warn you," he whispered. Later that afternoon, I decided I was done with letters and whispers. If Karen had a problem, she could say it to my face. I walked over to the HOA office, a renovated garage attached to her home, rebranded with a decal that read, Riverside Crest Community Authority. I knocked once, twice. The door swung open so fast it was clear she'd been standing right behind it. "Mr. Turner," she said brightly, "to what do I owe the pleasure?" I held up the notice she'd left. "I'd like to understand what this is." Her smile widened. "Just a friendly reminder that our meetings are designed to maintain harmony, not foster unnecessary alarm." "Alarm," I repeated. "Pointing out erosion is alarm. It is when phrased dramatically," she replied. "Statements about instability, collapse danger. Residents rely on us for peace of mind. Residents also rely on the ground staying under their feet." Her expression flickered just for a second. Then she stepped forward, closing the distance between us. "You've only been here a week, Mr. Turner," she said. "You're still learning how things work." "And how do they work exactly?" She tilted her head. "With order, with trust, with unity. Riverside Crest thrives on structure, and I intend to keep it that way." I crossed my arms. "I spent 30 years evaluating land stability. I'm not trying to cause trouble." "You already have," she answered, her voice dropping to a whisper sharpened by hostility. "One comment from you and 3 residents emailed me asking if their homes were in danger. Are they?" "That's not for you to decide," she snapped. She stepped back, smoothing down her blazer, regaining her polished facade. "If you want to contribute to our community, I suggest doing so positively. Leave the technical matters to the professionals we hire." "You hired surveyors," I said, "not geotechnical engineers." Her jaw tensed, a nerve struck. "I'm sure you mean well, Mr. Turner," she said finally. "But we can't let newcomers derail progress. The tower is happening, and I won't tolerate baseless fear-mongering. Consider this your final warning." There it was, the shift from polite condescension to open threat. I turned to leave, but she called after me. "Oh, and stay off the riverbank. You're not authorized to be down there. If I see you near that slope again, I'll have to escalate the matter formally." I didn't respond. I closed the door behind me and walked home with the heavy sinking certainty that Karen hadn't just brushed off my warning, she'd taken it as a personal insult. That night, the river whispered louder than usual. It wasn't my imagination. The current had moved a little more soil. The sycamore roots near my yard were exposed just a little more. The waterline crept a few inches closer. Nature was shifting. But Karen didn't want to see shifts. She only wanted control. As the sky darkened and wind skittered across the water, I realized something. Karen wasn't going to be my obstacle. She was going to be the catalyst. The force that took a natural risk and turned it into catastrophe. And for the first time since I'd moved in, I felt something more powerful than frustration. I felt dread. Karen didn't believe in my warning. Worse, she mocked it. And people who mock nature's warnings always learn the same lesson: the river doesn't have a sense of humor. It was a Saturday morning, bright and breezy, the kind that should have invited peace. I had just poured my first cup of black coffee when the sound of distant applause drifted in through my kitchen window. Applause not something I expected to hear echoing through the river bend at 8:15 a.m. I stepped outside and saw a small crowd gathering at the open field near the river, the same field I had warned them about, the one where the river had slowly gnawed away at its own bank like a dog worrying a bone. Folding chairs had been lined up, a banner flapping overhead that read, Riverside Crest, rising breaking ground for a bold future. I took a long sip of my coffee, more bitter than usual, and walked down toward the spectacle. There were balloons, a podium, even a table with HOA branded muffins. The whole thing had the theatrical air of a political rally. I noticed a few familiar faces, neighbors I'd seen walking their dogs, tending to their hedges. They were smiling and chatting like this was some kind of neighborhood fair, not the first act in a potential disaster movie. Then I saw Karen. She stood at the podium, in a pale blue suit that matched the sky, her posture straight, her smile rehearsed. To her left stood a man I didn't recognize, short, balding, wearing an expensive-looking navy suit and wraparound sunglasses. He held a golden ceremonial shovel. Karen raised a hand and the crowd quieted. "Thank you all for joining us today," she began, her voice amplified by a small speaker mounted on a stand beside her. "It is with great pride that I stand here on behalf of the Riverside Crest Homeowners Association, not just as your HOA president, but as someone who deeply believes in the promise of this community. Polite applause. She gestured toward the suited man. With the help of our partners at Wad Grand Axis Development, we are bringing our neighborhood into a bold, upward future. The Riverside Crest Tower will offer 30 stories of luxury condos, complete with a rooftop pool, on-site gym, and scenic views of our beautiful river. Beautiful, she said again, like it was a protective charm. I felt my jaw clench. This project will elevate property values, attract new residents, and place Riverside Crest on the map. We are no longer just a quiet suburb. We are a destination, a vision, a rising tide that lifts all homes. That line earned a few more claps. One woman even hooed. But the developer didn't clap. He just smiled politely, like he'd heard the same speech in a dozen other towns. Karen's eyes scanned the crowd until they landed on me, and then I swear she paused. I stood there, arms crossed in the back row. I didn't say a word, didn't make a face. But she saw me, and she smiled wider with that tight curl of superiority. Of course, she continued, change can bring questions, but I want to assure all of you, our engineers, consultants, and city inspectors have reviewed the site and approved every detail. This project is safe, thorough, and unstoppable. That last word echoed a little too hard in the speaker. She stepped aside and let the developer speak. His name was Todd Kruger. He said all the right things about investing in community, eco-sensitive design, and building with integrity. It was a dance. I'd seen it before. Gloss over the inconvenient truths, wrap everything in architectural renderings and statistics, then distract the crowd with shiny promises. When the speeches ended, Karen and Todd posed with a shovel in the center of the lot. With a few exaggerated movements, they broke ground, digging into the topsoil with media-friendly smiles. Someone snapped photos. Others clapped again. And just like that, the tower was official. Later that afternoon, I walked back down to the riverbank and stood at the edge, looking across the field where the ceremony had taken place. There were fresh flags staked into the earth markers for soil sampling, borehole drilling, and equipment placement. The problem was obvious to anyone who knew how to look. The field sloped gently downward toward the river, but it wasn't just the slope that mattered, it was the composition. I knelt and pressed my hand into the dirt. It crumbled softly, barely holding form. High sand content, low compaction, the kind of soil that soaks up water and shifts with every storm. And beneath that, decades of sediment layered over unstable silt. You don't build 30 stories on a foundation that moves when it rains. I looked back toward the houses, thinking maybe someone else had noticed. But the people I passed seemed oblivious. They smiled and waved as they walked past with dogs or strollers, high on the idea of increased property values and rooftop pools. They had bought into the fantasy. And no one was willing to be the voice of doubt when Karen had already decided this was a bold future. That night, I dug through one of my old storage bins in the garage and pulled out my weathered binder of hydrological maps from my service days. I found the topography charts for this area, dated but still accurate. The river's path had shifted nearly 12 feet in the past 10 years. There were signs of lateral undercutting. Aerial photos confirmed my memory. There was once a natural berm here, eroded over time, now replaced with compacted fill. I also had an old contact at the city planning department, someone who owed me a favor. I sent her an email asking for the full engineering reports submitted for the tower project. If the HOA claimed this plan was reviewed and approved, then the paper trail would show either gross negligence or worse, deliberate omission. The next morning, she replied, and there's not much in the city archive. The initial permit request was fast-tracked as part of a private HOA-managed build. Only a geotechnical summary was provided, no full borehole logs. I can flag it internally if needed. Fast-tracked, of course. Karen had used her network cut through red tape and pushed the project forward before anyone could question the details. But now someone was questioning. I printed out the sediment study, highlighted the soft zones, and circled areas of concerned shear strength. I made notes, dates, observations. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was preparing. This wasn't just about me being right. This was about preventing a disaster. Because if that tower fell, and I had every reason to believe it eventually would, people wouldn't just lose property. They could lose their lives. And if Karen was going to pretend this was all about progress, I was going to remind her what happens when you ignore the ground you're building on. The letter didn't come by mail this time. It was hand-delivered, slid into my screen door in a manila envelope stamped with the HOA's seal and marked confidential, time sensitive. Nothing about it was confidential by the time I read it twice on my porch, with the river murmuring behind me like it was trying to speak up too. The tone was precise, corporate, and just hostile enough to be called polite. It accused me of interfering with an approved community development project, undermining trust in board governance, and most egregiously, unauthorized distribution of technical assessments not sanctioned by the HOA. In plain English, I'd pissed off Karen, and she was ready to make it official. The threat was veiled, of course. They weren't stupid. Instead of demanding I stop or accusing me directly, the letter said, "The HOA reserves the right to escalate matters should this pattern of disruption continue." I had no doubt escalate was the key word here. That was Karen's way dress a loaded threat in bureaucratic language and hope you flinch. But I'd faced insurgents, bureaucrats, and weather systems that didn't care if you were ready. This was a theater show with bad lighting. Still, I knew how the system worked. One wrong step, and they'd find me. Another, and they'd sue. The HOA board wasn't just petty. They were strategic, and Karen, she was the kind of person who'd burn a bridge just to prove she could swim across faster than you. That afternoon, I sat in my garage flipping through the soil reports I'd collected, my own measurements, the geotechnical warning signs, rainfall data photos I'd taken of the riverbank over the past 3 weeks. The evidence didn't just point toward risk, it screamed it. But the problem was, Karen had already framed the narrative. I wasn't a retired engineer. I wasn't a concerned homeowner. I was disruptive, unqualified, a man obsessed with doomsday theories. She was building a paper wall around her tower project, and every notice, every public announcement, every newsletter was another brick. The next day, I received an invitation, if you could call it that, to attend a special HOA session. Not a general meeting. A closed-door, board-only discussion with me as the invited guest. I went. It was held in the HOA's community center, a squat building behind the neighborhood playground that looked like it was once a converted storage facility. Inside, the air was thick with cold coffee and controlled judgment. There were 5 board members seated at the table. Karen sat dead center, her hands neatly folded, her expression unreadable. The others, Mr. Briggs from Landscaping, Doreen from Community Events, Martin from Safety and Compliance, and Eleanor from Historical Preservation, all nodded as I took a seat across from them. No one said hello, Karen began. "Mr. Turner," she said, "we appreciate your presence here this evening." Didn't sound like I had a choice. A few of them shifted in their seats. Karen ignored the remark. "We've received multiple complaints from residents about your behavior, particularly your attempts to alarm homeowners about the tower project." I presented facts, I said. Not opinions, not panic, data. "You distributed unverified reports," she shot back. "They were based on public geological surveys and basic soil testing. Nothing I said was false." Karen leaned in, voice lower. "Intent matters. When a resident stands at a public meeting and warns that a structure could collapse into the river, it undermines confidence. Confidence that is essential to community stability. There won't be any stability if that tower slides 10 feet into the water during a storm." Martin interjected. "Mr. Turner, we've had professional contractors confirm the site is viable." Then release the full reports. Not the 2-page summary your developer submitted to fast-track the permit. Silence. I'd hit something. Karen took a breath. "This isn't a courtroom, Mr. Turner. We're a homeowners association. We're here to manage our neighborhood with order and trust. Then act like it." That earned me an icy glare. Eleanor shifted and whispered something to Doreen. Karen caught it, then cleared her throat. "This meeting is not about debating science. It's about community behavior. We're officially notifying you that continued interference will result in disciplinary action under the association bylaws, including financial penalties and potential legal proceedings for slander and public disturbance." I sat back. "So we're calling truth slander now." Karen raised a printed page and placed it on the table. It was a screenshot my email to the city planning office requesting the full engineering files. "This is beyond the scope of homeowner concern," she said. "You're involving municipal departments in an internal project." "Because internal doesn't mean invisible," I replied. "Not when it threatens public safety." She smiled the same way she did when she'd publicly dismissed me at the meeting. "You're outnumbered here, Mr. Turner. You've lived in Riverside Crest for what, a month? Long enough to see the cracks forming literally and figuratively. We'll be sending a formal letter of censure, she said. And any future public statements you make about the tower must go through board approval or will be considered defamation. I stared at them all one by one. They weren't debating whether I was right. They were debating how to silence me before I could prove it. So I leaned forward. You can send all the letters you want, but if that tower goes up and something goes wrong, there'll be investigations. Not just civil, criminal, negligence, liability. You think I'm disruptive, fine. But when that tower slides into the river, and it will, people won't be asking what I did. They'll be asking what you covered up. Karen's mouth tightened, but she didn't reply. I stood and walked out. That night, the rain started again, soft at first, then heavier. I stood by my porch flashlight in hand, watching the water pool in the lower yards. The river was rising again. It always did in this season. That was the part no one seemed to understand. It didn't take a hurricane or a landslide, just time water and denial. And the HOA had built its future on all three. The rain kept coming. Not a violent storm, not yet, but a slow, persistent drizzle that soaked into the bones of the neighborhood. By the third day, the air was thick with humidity and unease. Gutters overflowed. Puddles lingered long after they should have drained. And the river crept closer. I watched from my kitchen window as muddy runoff streamed down the slope behind the development site. The field where Karen and her developer had posed with that golden shovel was now a mire of tire tracks and sinking equipment. The ceremonial flags marking the future tower's footprint had begun to tilt in the wind, listing like little white lies exposed to the elements. I knew the ground couldn't take much more, so I decided to stop waiting. I called in a favor. Her name was Janet Reyes, a city infrastructure analyst I'd worked with years ago during a post-flood remediation project. She'd once said I was the only person who ever brought the right questions to the table, questions the bureaucrats didn't want asked. Michael Turner, she said when she picked up. I figured it was you. You still at city planning. Unfortunately, what are you digging into? Something soft, I said. Literally. She chuckled, but the humor faded quickly. Let me guess. HOA development. Worse, fast-tracked tower near a riverbank. They're suppressing the actual soil data. I'm looking for whatever didn't make it into the public archive. Let me check something, she said. I heard her keyboard click for a while. You're right. That's odd. What? There's no Phase 2 subsurface report on file. That's required if they're building anything over 5 stories, especially on compromised terrain. But the permit approval stamp is here. They skipped it. Looks like they submitted a preliminary soil analysis and used a grandfather clause tied to a 20-year-old zoning plan from before the creek expanded its erosion zone. That zone changed dramatically in the last decade. Exactly. Which means the permit should have been re-reviewed under the current floodplain overlay, but someone pushed it through. I felt my chest tighten. Can you send me whatever you've got? I'll send it tonight unofficially. You didn't get it from me. You've always had a heroic streak, Janet. Don't flatter me, Turner. You're the one poking bears with sticks again. By 7 p.m., I had a secure zip folder in my inbox. The documents were messy redacted sections, scanned blueprints, internal memos, with half-missing headers. But the pieces were there. All I needed to do was follow the cracks. One document stood out: Site Compaction and Retention Evaluation. Draft not for circulation. It was dated 6 months before the tower plan had been announced. It included 4 test borings along the proposed foundation grid. All 4 showed high water permeability and a failure to meet minimum compaction thresholds for vertical construction. In layman's terms, the ground was too wet, too loose, and too unstable to safely hold that much weight. One memo unsigned suggested amending soil with imported fill and concrete footings to create the appearance of stability for initial inspection. I stared at that sentence for a long time. That wasn't ignorance, that was fraud. I printed every page, laid them out on my dining room table like a crime scene. Because that's what it was. A crime in slow motion, waiting for gravity to finish the job. I needed someone else to see this, someone neutral, someone who couldn't be dismissed as a disruptive homeowner. So I contacted Ben Lawford, a civil engineering professor at the local university. We'd crossed paths years ago during a joint course university program on post-disaster soil recovery. He was blunt, brilliant, and hated bureaucratic cover-ups more than I did. He agreed to meet the next morning. At 9 a.m., I laid the papers out in front of him on the metal table at a downtown coffee shop. Ben flipped through them, frowning deeper with every page. "These were submitted," he asked. "Only the first 2 pages. The rest never made it into the city file." He ran a hand through his beard. "Jesus, Mike, this site is one rainfall away from liquefaction." "That's what I've been trying to tell them." He looked up. "You realize what this means, right? If they pour foundation and build on this without mitigation, the entire structure could shear not gradually, but catastrophically. I've already warned them." They laughed. He tapped a memo with his knuckle. "You need to go public. They'll call it fear-mongering. Then get someone louder than the HOA to say it for you." That's when I knew what I had to do. The HOA controlled the neighborhood, but they didn't control the press. That night, I contacted a local environmental journalist, Tasha Green, who had built a reputation investigating shady developments and exposing city council corruption. I sent her everything. The photos, the reports, the memos. I told her about the fast-tracking, the missing approvals, the threat letters. She called me within the hour. "This is gold," she said. "If half of this checks out, someone's going to jail." I didn't say it, but I hoped Karen was first in line. "I'm running a feature. Front page Sunday edition. I want to come see the site for myself." So the next morning, under a blanket of mist and light drizzle, I met Tasha at the edge of the construction zone. She wore hiking boots, carried a camera, and had a look in her eye that reminded me of a searchlight, wide, bright, and unrelenting. We walked the perimeter, and I showed her the bank's undercut edges, the pooling water near the survey stakes, and the way the soil moved like pudding beneath our boots. She took dozens of photos, even recording the sound of the river. When we reached the spot where the first pile driver had arrived, she paused. "They're starting this week." "Yep. Foundation pour scheduled in 3 days." She shook her head. "This isn't bold. It's criminal." That night, I slept restlessly. Not from fear, from anticipation. I knew what was coming. But this time, so would everyone else. Because once that article dropped, the soil wouldn't be the only thing collapsing under pressure. The Sunday paper hit doorsteps just after dawn. By 6:45 a.m., I was already outside with a steaming mug in hand when I saw the headline. HOA fast-tracks tower on unstable riverbank experts warn of imminent collapse risk. Beneath it was a photo Tasha had taken from the bend in the river, where the muddy slope leaned treacherously into the water like a drunk man testing his balance. And beside that, in a separate frame, was Karen Davenport, smiling proudly at the groundbreaking ceremony, golden shovel in hand. The contrast was surgical. It didn't take long. By 8:00 a.m., my phone started buzzing with unknown numbers. Some were reporters, others were neighbors. A few were HOA members trying to do damage control under the sudden heat of scrutiny. I let most of the calls go to voicemail. I didn't need to say anything. The facts were out. Let them echo. I walked down the street just as the sun peeked through the low clouds. Up ahead, near the now-fenced construction zone, a small crowd had gathered. Some curious, some angry, some just nosy enough to chase whatever story had temporarily replaced their HOA-approved landscaping drama. But what caught my eye wasn't the neighbors, it was the concrete truck, a massive white rumbling beast of a machine pulling up beside the field with East Line pouring cone, painted on the side in bold orange letters. It idled for a while, and then out came the crew, 5 men in hard hats, neon vests, and clipboards. They weren't here to talk, they were here to pour. I crossed the field with purpose, the damp grass squishing underfoot. Karen was already there, speaking urgently with Todd Kruger, the developer. Her voice was low, strained, sharp as a snapped wire. But when she saw me, she straightened like a pageant queen. "You need to leave the site immediately," she said. "This is an active construction zone." "This is a crime scene in progress," I replied calmly. Todd stepped forward. "We're within our legal rights. Permits are cleared." I raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" "The city planning office called for an internal review this morning." That article reached the mayor's desk. Karen didn't flinch, but I saw Todd pale slightly. "Even so," she said, regaining her footing, "this is private HOA-managed land. You have no jurisdiction here." "Funny," I said. "Because gravity doesn't care about jurisdiction." As if summoned by the tension, a voice called out from the sidewalk. "Hey, are you really building on that slope?" It was a man I didn't recognize, probably a reader from the next neighborhood over. More people followed. Cameras emerged. So did phones. A couple from across the street live-streamed the scene. The HOA was losing the one thing they had depended on control of the narrative. Karen's smile started to crack. I walked away and stood by the fence watching as the workers lined up the rebar grids and prepped the trench. The ground was visibly soggy. One of them stepped, sank half an inch, muttered something, and reset his footing. Another laughed nervously. I caught it on video. 2 hours later, I uploaded it to a local watchdog page on social media. It got shared 20 times in the first 10 minutes, then 100, then more. The pressure was building not just in the soil. By midday, the first pour was complete. Slabs of concrete rested on the wet foundation base like thick bandages slapped over a wound. No matter how smooth they looked, I knew what they were hiding underneath. And then on Monday, the cracking started. It was subtle at first. A neighbor emailed me a photo, a hairline fracture, across the edge of her patio nearest the development site. Another sent me a video her back door wouldn't close anymore. The frame had shifted. Foundation creep. I made notes, documented everything. By Tuesday, sidewalks buckled along the eastern edge of the block. HOA maintenance blamed tree root pressure, but there weren't any trees nearby. Karen sent out a community-wide email titled, "Tower construction temporary settling is normal." I printed it out, framed it, and set it on my desk under the headline from the Sunday paper. On Wednesday, a rainstorm swept through. Not a catastrophic one, just enough to saturate the already weak terrain. By 3 p.m., standing water formed in the construction trench. By 4, the crew left early, leaving pumps running and tarps flapping. At 5, I walked past and noticed a fissure, about 2 inches wide, running from the corner of the first concrete slab to the edge of the site. I took a picture, measured it, and sent it to Professor Lawford. His reply was one line: "It's already failing." I forwarded the image to Janet Reyes at City Planning. She responded with an even shorter line: "Meeting called for tomorrow. They're not happy." Neither was Karen. That night, just as I was finishing dinner, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find her standing there. No smile this time, no name tag, just fury carved into her face like erosion lines in stone. "You have no idea what you've done," she hissed. "I think I have a pretty good idea. I've worked 10 years to elevate this community, and now you've dragged it through the mud, literally and publicly." I didn't drag anything, I said, voice level. "You built a tower on a riverbank. The ground did the rest." Her eyes welled with something that wasn't sadness, it was desperation. That rare raw place pride goes when the truth is undeniable and humiliating. "You don't get to win this," she whispered. "I'm not trying to win. I'm trying to keep it from collapsing." She turned, jaw clenched, and walked into the darkness. That night, the rain intensified. I barely slept. I sat on my porch with a flashlight watching as rivulets of water formed small channels down the slope toward the river, carrying fresh mud with them. At 2:15 a.m., I heard something sharp, a crack, a snap, a low rumble. I stood heart pounding and walked to the edge of the property line. And there in the moonlight I saw it. One of the concrete slabs had shifted just a few inches, but it was enough. The first movement had begun, and the river was waiting. The storm wasn't on the forecast. That's what made it worse. The local weather station had predicted scattered light showers, a soft drizzle here and there. Nothing significant, nothing dangerous. But nature doesn't read forecasts, and the clouds that arrived Thursday morning weren't here for gentle warnings. They rolled in thick and gray, low enough to scrape the tips of the old sycamores lining the neighborhood. I stood at the edge of my porch, watching the sky fold over itself, darkening like a bruise. By noon, the wind picked up, not violently, but constantly, like it had somewhere to be. The rain started as a mist, then escalated with the steady rhythm of a ticking clock. It didn't stop. Not for lunch, not for dusk, not even when night fell and the river started whispering louder. I didn't sleep. I sat by my window with the lights off and eyes open, listening. My old field gear raincoat, boots, gloves hung by the door ready. I hadn't worn it since retirement. But muscle memory doesn't forget what to do when terrain shifts beneath your feet. Around midnight, the first real sign of trouble arrived. A low metallic groan echoed across the back field. I rushed to the edge of my yard and raised my flashlight toward the construction site. The beam cut through the sheets of rain just enough to catch it. The steel rebar framing for the tower's next section had tilted slightly, like a hand slowly tipping over. I scanned the ground. The trench around the initial pour was filled with muddy water, nearly spilling over. The earth around the perimeter shimmered with micro-collapses, small dips, where the soil had sloughed away under the pressure of saturation. The tower's bones were sinking, slowly, quietly, like a ship that didn't know it was already sinking. At 2:00 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was Harvey, my nervous, soft-spoken neighbor who'd warned me weeks ago to be careful. His voice was trembling. "Mike," he said, "my garage floor has a crack. I just stepped in a puddle inside my house. Water's coming up through the tile. Get your wife. Turn off the main breaker. Get out and come here." He didn't ask questions. By 2:25 a.m., Harvey and his wife were in my living room, wrapped in blankets, soaked and stunned. I handed them each a cup of coffee and told them to sit tight. Then I pulled on my boots, grabbed my floodlight, and went back out into the night. It was worse than I expected. Sidewalks had ruptured along the far side of the development zone. A street lamp leaned slightly like a drunk staggering toward the road. Several driveways were covered in fine layers of slick brown silt soil that had been carried down slope in slow, methodical waves. And then I saw at the far corner of the poured concrete slab had dropped nearly 6 inches, now half submerged in brown water that churned like soup. This was it. I pulled out my phone and hit record. Time is 2:39 a.m. This is Michael Turner. I'm documenting what appears to be partial foundational collapse at the Riverside Crest tower site. The structural slab is no longer level. Water pooling indicates failure of the drainage mitigation plan. Likely signs of subsurface liquefaction underway. The footage was shaky, rain-streaked, and dim, but it didn't matter. I had it. At 3:06 a.m., a shout cut through the storm. I turned and saw another neighbor, Lisa, 2 streets over, running in the rain with no umbrella, her robe plastered to her frame. "There's a hole in my backyard," she screamed. It opened up near the fence. I can see rebar through the mud. I followed her. What I saw next turned my stomach. A fresh fissure, 3 feet wide, had opened up along the edge of her property line. Not just a crack. A sink, an actual section of earth that had given way, revealing the edge of the tower's rebar skeleton under what should have been stable ground. The tower's underground supports were literally breaching into residential land. I called Tasha, the journalist. She answered on the second ring, breathless. "I'm already on my way," she said. Half the city's emergency channels lit up. I heard a dispatcher mention Riverside Crest. You were right. I relayed what I saw. She promised to bring a drone crew and 2 photographers. By the time the first rays of daylight broke through the storm clouds, more than 50 residents had gathered at the main access road. Some in pajamas, some in rubber boots, some just holding each other with pale faces and wide eyes. And right in front of them stood the tower's foundation, sunken, cracked, and visibly unstable. At 7:12 a.m., the eastern slab gave way. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a soft, muffled crump, like a sigh from the earth itself. But then, like a thread unraveling the rebar frame, warped under tension, snapping in 3 places. Mud surged into the space beneath the slab, and a thick section of concrete collapsed into the hollow void, sending a plume of water and soil into the air like a geyser. People screamed. Phones rose. Cameras flashed. Even from a distance, I could see Karen standing near the HOA trailer, her face pale, her mouth parted in disbelief. She wasn't holding a clipboard. She wasn't giving orders. She was watching her dream drown. Todd Kruger arrived minutes later, his suit soaked, before he made it 10 feet into the site. He shouted into a phone, cursing, gesturing, trying to salvage authority from a scene that had none left. It was over. The site was cordoned off within the hour. City officials arrived next, then a team from the Department of Building Safety. The yellow tape stretched across the site like a noose pulled tight around a bad idea. That afternoon, Karen issued a statement to the press. Unexpected weather conditions contributed to a temporary destabilization of the site. The HOA is working closely with city engineers to address resident concerns. But the photos told the truth. The tower had failed, and everyone saw it. I didn't cheer. I didn't gloat. I stood in the rain and watched as they tried to cover the wound with tarps and excuses. And the river, swollen and victorious, carried their lies downstream. It happened at 4:17 a.m. on a Saturday, 2 days after the storm, and just as the ground gave up, pretending it could hold anything at all. I wasn't asleep. Not because I couldn't, but because I wouldn't. The nights had grown too quiet in the aftermath of the chaos. The rain had stopped, but it left behind a tension so heavy it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. I was sitting at my kitchen table, papers and reports spread out like a map of ignored warnings when I felt it. A low vibration. Barely there, like a train passing miles away, or a distant thunder no one else heard. The glass in my cabinet rattled once, then stopped. A beat passed, then another. And then the sound came. A groan. Long and wet and deep, the kind of sound that makes animals flee, and men stop breathing. It rolled across the neighborhood like a voice, emerging from the ground itself. I grabbed my flashlight and stormed out the door, boots crunching through the wet gravel of my side yard. My instincts, long dormant, took over. I wasn't a retiree anymore. I was a field engineer racing toward an active failure zone. By the time I got to the corner where the sidewalk met the construction fence, I saw it. And I swear time slowed. The remaining sections of the tower's foundation had begun to slide, not crumble, not explode, just drift, as if the entire slab was floating on jelly. The saturated soil beneath it had liquefied, becoming the very thing I warned them about. The slab sank at a slight angle, creating pressure against the remaining vertical rebar skeleton. The steel bent, snapped. And then the eastern quadrant of the project rebar concrete scaffolding broke loose like the hull of a ship torn open by the sea. It didn't fall straight down. It tilted. A slow, monstrous lean that pulled everything with it, the site trailer, the survey flags, the rebar stacks, and every inch of Karen's bold future. The ground cracked. Water burst from the fissures. Then came the deep rumble, not like thunder, but like 100 boulders tumbling through a tunnel made of mud. And then, silence, followed by a sharp, wet collapse, as a chunk of the foundation sheared off and slid into the river below. The water surged upward in response, swallowing concrete and steel, like it had been waiting to devour it all along. And somewhere behind me, a scream ripped through the morning. I turned. Karen was there. She stood barefoot, in her robe soaked and shivering, framed by the pulsing red and blue strobes of approaching emergency vehicles. Her eyes, hollow and frozen, were locked on the space where the tower used to be. She didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there as the mud swallowed her reflection in the puddles forming at her feet. Behind her, residents poured from their homes. Neighbors who once cheered at the groundbreaking now clutched each other's arms and phones, their faces pale and wet with sweat and rain. No one asked if the collapse was over. We all knew it wasn't, because it had never been about the tower. It had been about the denial, the arrogance, the refusal to listen. It had been about her. The fire trucks arrived first, then the structural engineers. They cordoned off the area, pushed people back, yelled for room. I showed them where the sinkholes were forming, pointed out the fault lines I had mapped, the runoff channels I had traced, the red flags no one had wanted to see. Within an hour, half the site had been declared a danger zone. Several adjacent homes were evacuated. My neighbor Harvey, whose garage had been first to crack, stood with his wife on my lawn, hands trembling as city officials marked the edge of his foundation with orange paint and grim expressions. By midday, helicopters buzzed overhead. The local news anchors stood in rubber boots delivering breathless reports. Tasha, the journalist, found me in the crowd, pressed a mic to my chest, and asked the question no one else dared. "Mr. Turner, did you know this would happen?" I looked her in the eye. The camera lens behind her blinked red. "I knew it could," I said. "I tried to stop it." Behind me, Karen was sitting on the curb, now head in her hands, HOA name tag discarded in the mud beside her. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't defiant. She was just small. The collapse had taken more than concrete. It had taken credibility, control, power. It had stripped her down to the reality she fought so hard to ignore. Tasha lowered her mic. "I heard the city's launching a formal investigation." "They should," I said. "Not just into the site, into the HOA board. The permitting shortcuts, the fake reports, all of it." That night, the mayor issued a public statement. The Riverside Crest Tower collapse highlights a failure in oversight, community leadership, and regulatory compliance. We are committed to a full investigation and accountability. It was the first time the word collapse had been used officially. No more instability. No more unexpected conditions. They had finally called it what it was. Karen was removed from the HOA board within 48 hours. A special emergency election was scheduled. The developer Todd Kruger was subpoenaed for permit fraud and perjury. Multiple lawsuits were filed. Homeowners with cracked foundations, displaced families, financial loss. The neighborhood buzzed with phrases like, liability exposure, geotechnical reevaluation, and class action. And me, I kept my porch light on. Neighbors I barely knew came to shake my hand. A few apologized. Others simply nodded with the quiet humility of people who had witnessed their illusions sink into the river. But I didn't want their praise. I wanted the land to breathe again. And I wanted people to remember. You don't win when you build over warnings. You only delay the fall. By the time Monday rolled around, Riverside Crest didn't feel like a neighborhood anymore. It felt like a crime scene, with front lawns. The quiet hum of sprinklers and leaf blowers had been replaced by the whine of ground-penetrating radar equipment, the thud of soil core samplers, and the constant presence of orange-vested city officials walking door to door with clipboards and grim expressions. And the HOA office, closed, locked, its windows dark. A crude cardboard sign duct-taped to the door read, "Board meetings suspended until further notice." Karen's name had been scrubbed from the HOA website. Her profile photo, that one with the blue blazer and 2 white teeth, was gone. The leadership page now just said, "Temporary administrative review in progress." But it was more than a website update. The entire board had fractured overnight. 3 of the 5 members resigned in the span of a week. One issued a written apology, Doreen, the community events coordinator, who claimed she had no knowledge of the foundation risks and had placed full trust in Karen's judgment. I didn't believe her. None of us did. The lawsuits came next. By Wednesday, I counted 6 civil suits filed in county court homeowners whose property lines had been compromised, residents whose driveways had cracked wide open, even one couple who claimed emotional distress after watching their backyard collapse into a drainage ditch. The most devastating suit came from the family who had just moved in 3 months ago, paying nearly $890,000 for one of the new corner lots bordering the construction zone. Their entire home was now condemned, unlivable, tilted on its foundation like a cardboard model melting in the rain. Their lawsuit named the developer, the HOA board, and the city permitting office. And guess what? My name came up in the filing, not as a defendant, but as a witness. They listed me as a documented early whistleblower. It was the first time I'd ever seen that word used without someone trying to insult me. City Hall launched its formal investigation the same week. Janet Reyes, my contact at the planning department, emailed me privately. "Your data was confirmed. We've flagged the tower project for permit fraud, soil report misrepresentation, and failure to disclose geotechnical risks. The mayor's office is considering criminal referral to the DA. You did the right thing." I stared at those 3 sentences for a long time. They didn't feel like vindication, not exactly. Vindication is clean. This felt messy, heavy. Like winning a battle, but finding the battlefield littered with people you'd tried to save. One afternoon, 2 city inspectors showed up at my door. They introduced themselves with soft voices and careful language, the kind that said, "We're grateful, but cautious." I brought them inside, offered them coffee, and laid out every document I had, the Phase 2 bore logs. Janet had helped me acquire the memo about the soil amendment deception, my own notes with GPS-tagged photos showing erosion migration over time. They stayed for 2 hours. One of them, a woman named Eleanor, not the HOA. Eleanor, a younger, sharper one, flipped through my binder and asked quietly, "You ever think about going back into the field?" "I did my time," I said. "Now I just want to keep my house upright." She smiled faintly. "Well, you may have kept a few others upright too. But not all of them." A week after the collapse, I walked past the edge of the old construction zone. It had been completely fenced off now, covered in plastic sheeting to prevent further soil washout. A sign had been posted by the city. "No entry, unsafe structure order of Building Safety Commission." Beyond the fence, the remains of the slab jutted out from the ground like broken teeth. Rebar rusted in the sun. Concrete split in jagged fault lines. The river whispered nearby, calm again, as if it had gotten what it came for. And then I saw her. Karen. She was sitting in her car at the far end of the block, engine off, hands on the wheel. Just staring. Not crying. Not raging. Just hollow. Like all the oxygen had been sucked out of her world. I didn't wave. She didn't see me. We were done with each other. But part of me wanted to ask, what did it cost you? Not money, not reputation. Those things come and go. I meant the deeper cost, the belief that control was the same thing as wisdom. That appearances could hold up a structure built on lies. That you could mock nature, or science, or warnings, and not get swallowed for it. But she didn't need me to ask. The river already had. That weekend, a town hall was called. This time, the community center overflowed with people not for muffins or balloon arches, but because they were angry. Not just at Karen, at themselves, for letting it happen, for staying quiet, for clapping when they should have asked questions. The acting HOA chair, a man named Victor Lang, a retired attorney, stepped up to the podium and took a long breath before he spoke. "We're not here to defend what happened," he said. "We're here to rebuild from it. Literally, ethically, transparently." Someone clapped, then another, then the whole room. And then he looked right at me. And if it weren't for one neighbor's stubborn persistence, this story would have ended with ambulances instead of lawsuits. I shifted in my chair, uncomfortable with the attention. But that's the thing about truth. It's rarely loud, rarely welcomed, rarely comfortable. It's just right. The following week, they asked me to sit on the oversight committee for future HOA projects. I declined. I told them I'd be happy to advise, review plans, speak up when needed. But I didn't want a title. I didn't need power. I just needed the neighborhood to learn how to listen again, not just to each other, but to the ground beneath them. Because it's always speaking. And the next time someone hears it whisper, maybe they'll remember what happens when you don't listen. Fall came slowly that year. The leaves along the riverbank didn't just turn yellow, they seemed to exhale. After everything after the collapse, the lawsuits, the HOA purge, and the endless finger-pointing, the entire neighborhood felt like it was learning how to breathe again. Like it had been holding something in tension denial, a false idea of control, and finally, let it go. Karen sold her house. No announcement, no farewell. One day, there was a moving truck parked out front, and the next, the windows were dark. Word had it she left the state. Something about a sister in Arizona. Something about needing space. She left behind a perfectly trimmed lawn, an empty mailbox, and a name that no one in Riverside Crest dared speak above a whisper anymore. The developer, Todd Kruger, was indicted for permit fraud and falsifying engineering documents. Grand Axis Development folded within a month. The state seized their records. His mugshot ran on every local news site with the headline, "Luxury Tower Developer Charged in Riverbank Collapse Scandal." Funny how quickly power evaporates when the ground beneath it gives way. The HOA board was restructured completely. Victor Lang, the retired attorney who had spoken truth at the town hall, became interim chair. He appointed an independent engineering oversight committee staffed by professionals from nearby universities' state geological offices. And much to my protest, they insisted. Not as an HOA member, Victor said, as a watchman. I still remember the first meeting we had in the community center after everything. The windows were open. The air smelled like wet pine and honesty. People sat in a circle. No podium, no hierarchy. Just neighbors finally talking, not through fines or notices or veiled threats, but actual words. Fear had burned away the smugness. Humility had taken its place. We voted to create a permanent environmental risk review board. We put a moratorium on any development within 200 feet of the river. And we started hosting public education nights, geology for homeowners, climate impact, awareness, soil health, basics. You'd be amazed how many people didn't know what a water table was until they watched their patio disappear into one. I stood at the back of most meetings, listening more than speaking. I didn't need to raise my voice anymore. The river had done that for me. One afternoon in early November, I took a walk down the path where the tower was supposed to rise. The fencing was gone now, replaced by thick yellow grass and rows of planted native trees. The city had designated the entire lot a riparian recovery zone, and school kids came every few weeks to plant more vegetation and stabilize the slope with netting and biodegradable logs. Funny, the riverbank had never looked more alive. Where concrete was once meant to rise 30 stories, cottonwoods now stretched for the sky. I stood at the edge of the newly repaired trail and ran my hand across the smooth grain of a wooden sign posted beside a fresh oak sapling. It read, "Riverside Restoration Area." In honor of those who spoke truth before it became history. No names, no plaques, just quiet truth. And that was enough. I got a call from Janet Reyes a few months later. She was moving on, promoted to a regional position, overseeing infrastructure resilience projects. Before she left, she wanted to let me know that the Riverside Crest collapse had inspired the city to launch a complete overhaul of its fast-track development policy. No more back doors, no more rubber-stamped permits. Every soil report would be reviewed independently, permanently. "You started something," she said. "I didn't want to start anything," I replied. "I just wanted them to stop." She laughed. "Well, you did both." And so life moved forward. Harvey and his wife had their foundation repaired. They brought over banana bread every Sunday, like clockwork. Lisa, the woman whose backyard had torn open during the storm, went on to start a local flood watch group. She even spoke at a state conference. Tasha, the journalist, won an award for her story. She mailed me a copy of the article, framed. I hung it in the garage next to my old Army Corps service photo. Two kinds of battlefields. As for me, I rebuilt my porch steps, replanted a patch of native grass near the river, walked the trails every evening with a thermos of coffee in hand and the rustle of leaves at my back. No one mocked me anymore. No one dismissed the river. And when the water rose again, as it always does, people noticed. They measured. They adjusted. They listened. They had learned. Not because of fear, but because the earth had taught them through cracked pavement and vanished pride that nature does not bargain. It only balances. Sometimes I sit at the edge of the riverbank, just above where the slab once slid into the water. The current moves gently now, carrying leaves and driftwood, like soft reminders of how easily things can fall apart when we pretend they're unshakable. And I think about how Karen used to stand at HOA meetings, arms crossed, voice clipped and polished, declaring herself a protector of order. But order without truth is just ego in a uniform. This land didn't need control. It needed care. And now finally it has it. Because I stayed. Because the river demanded someone listen. Because sometimes the only way to build something lasting is to let what was false collapse completely. And now the ground breathes. And so do I.